Okay, I believe we do have a quorum. Could Mr. Fike, I believe Mr. Fike, could you let me know if you are on the call today? All right, well, now we do actually have a quorum. So Mr. Rossi just arrived, so that gives us our 4, so we can get started.
Good morning, Sherry Brown. We'll start with our welcome and introductions. Do you mind starting now that you walked in? Just say your name and, yeah. Okay. And again, Sherry Brown.
Heather Frederick, Chief Financial Officer.
Nicole Smith, Director of Federal Programs.
McCormick, Director, Exceptional Student Education.
We have also Mr. Longhofer as a public, in the public. You have a Miss Lewis, is that your name? Paige Lewis. And then on virtually, we have Miss Lori Benino. We have principal representatives that are available if the committee has any school-based questions and that we need their assistance on. Ms. Leanne Evans, the district treasurer. And that is everybody that we have online.
All right, this is time for public comment. We do have a couple of people. Would either of you like to comment this morning? Nope, okay. So then we have our minutes from our May 26th meeting. Did anybody have any comments on those? Can I get a motion to approve? I have a motion by Faith. Mr. Lassie, would you do a second for me? Okay. Anybody oppose? Seeing none, the minutes approve unanimously. And then I'll turn it over to Heather for discussion items.
I also wanted to recognize that Mr. Stephen Fike just joined as well. All right. Oops. So it has been a very interesting legislative session. Last night, I have some breaking news that the legislature did approve the budget at like 8 o'clock last night, but we still only have the summary budget. I don't have a full detailed run for our district. So I just still have more the higher level overview of what we're expecting. And I can give some updates of the changes of what was approved by the legislature last night. So for our next meeting, we will have the final budget. In speaking with our lobbyist, most everything is going to be decided this weekend. So for the board workshop next week, we will have finalized budget numbers as well as all the different bills that are going to pass, anticipated to pass. Since this is the first meeting for the Budget Advisory Committee, I just wanted to give an overview of the budget, and then an overview of how our district budget is compiled. So starting with just the education fund timeline, all of our funding, the majority of our funding is set by state legislature, and we don't really have much flexibility. So the State Board of Education submits their legislative budget request in August of each year. They're required by statute. That used to be the high water mark. It no longer is. Now, next we go on to the long-range financial outlook. That has to be released by the Office of Economic and Demographic Research in September of each year, and it gives a long-range financial outlook to ensure that the state isn't going to put, and the legislature isn't going to put the state into any financial emergency, that they understand the amount of non-recurring revenue that's available, They understand what the impact is of all of the different legislative actions that they take. The governor, depending on when the legislative session starts, because every other year, one year it starts in January, like it did this year. Every even-numbered year, it starts in January, and every odd year, it starts in March. So depending on when the legislative session is going to start, the governor releases his proposed budget in either November or December timeframe. And this year, the legislative session started on January 9th. So we are really, truly at the tail end of it, but there is still a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot that we don't know as to where the bills are going to end up and what the financial impact of those bills are going to be. And a lot of that is going to be decided this weekend because they do need to be done by Monday of next week in order to make sure that they meet the cooling off period before the end of session. So looking at the long-range financial outlook, Ms. Amy Baker presented to the Senate Committee on Appropriations on September 8th. It was a positive outlook in that the state has a lot of money available in reserves. And that's the same situation our district is in as well. We have a lot of money in reserves as a result of those federal funds that we received, the federal ESSER funds. And what Ms. Baker, said that there is a lot of money, but we also have to be very careful how we spend those monies and that we're not spending those reserves on recurring expenses. So being very strategic and making sure that you're spending them on non-recurring initiatives. And so that's the same challenge that we face in our district. We've been able to build up our fund balance as a result of those ESSER funds, and which is the same thing that we did back during the Great Recession. And now we're going to take time in order to spend those funds down on non-recurring initiatives or having a plan as to how we can build in those expenses into the recurring budget. So looking at the state funding proposals, so this is prior to what was agreed to last night. And this is looking at it statewide, not looking at it for a particular district. And we can see that, the bulk of the increase that there was a difference between the House and the Senate runs on the amount, what they expected the FTE, the increase in FTE to be. And that I was expecting that they would end up with the higher FTE of the House of the 3.18 million versus the Senate, which is 10,000 less. It looks like in the proposal that was approved last night, they went with the Senate version of FTE. And the difference between the House and the Senate was that the House had a higher expectation of what the increase in the voucher students were going to be. The impact for our district, though, was not much different between the House and the Senate versions. It was only a difference of, I would say, about 800 students, and the other reason that I'm also waiting for why it's important for us to get the actual detailed run to see by school district is that there was an additional enrollment estimating conference, an updated enrollment estimating conference after the state received input from districts as to what we thought our enrollment was going to be. And in Palm Beach County, the state projections were that our district-operated enrollment was going to decline by 400, charter school enrollment was going to increase by 400, and that the vouchers would increase by about 8,000. So we aligned with and agreed with the amount with the vouchers. We did not necessarily agree with the increase of 400 students in charter schools because this current year we actually saw a decrease in our charter school enrollment of 400 students. And then we also didn't agree that we're going to see a decrease in district-operated enrollment of 400 students because this year we actually saw an increase in enrollment in our district-operated schools. Like I said, while the charter actually saw a decline for one of the first years. In looking at the increase in the BSA, for the first two proposals, it was at 3.4% or an increase of $175. You compare that to what we had last year in FY24, and we had a much higher increase. It looks like we had a much higher increase of 12%, but that was just because that was inflated because a lot of the categoricals were pushed into the base student allocation. So you really have to move down to the total funds per FTE to see what the true increase is. And if you look, the House and Senate were proposing an increase of 2.5%. Last year, we ended up with, based on the third calculation, an increase near to 6%. And keep in mind, this is statewide. Based on the budget that was approved last night, the increase that was agreed to was 2.75%. Or an increase of $240 per student, which is half of what we received this current year. The other differences in the proposals was just whether there was going to be money set aside in a teacher compensation categorical within the base student allocation, and whether there was going to be an increase in safe schools and mental health. So where they ended up with is having an increase in the required set aside from BSA for teacher compensation. And there is also an increase in the mental health as well as the safe schools categorical. So they kind of combined the two between the House and Senate proposals as to the amount that's required to be set aside. And so that's where the state sets our funding. So they not only set our funding, but they also dictate how we're going to spend the increase in funds that we receive. In getting into the bills that have a financial impact, starting with the conversion charter schools, this was House Bill 109 and Senate Bill 246. It does not appear that this bill is going to pass, but our concern with this bill, and it was specifically written to address some issues that are in Broward County. There are some charter schools. Broward County has a lot of vacant land for school sites, and there are some charter schools that would like access to that land for them to build schools. And what this legislation stated was if a school district had declining enrollment in their district-operated schools for 2 years in a row, that they would have to give the charter schools access to that land. So it does not appear that this is going to pass. So that's the first one with conversion charter schools. The Florida retirement benefits, this House Bill 151 and Senate Bill 7024, we still have a lot of uncertainty with this bill. And this one bill could potentially have the most significant impact on our budget because it's very different as to where the Senate stands and the House stands. The Senate version has really no change in FRS, so there would be no change in our rate, it would be flat. The House bill adds back a 3% COLA for everybody hired prior to July 1st of 2021. And then everybody hired after July 1st of 2011 would then be considered at a later date as to whether the COLA would be added into those retirement benefits. The financial impact to Palm Beach County of the House bill would be an increase in the rate of approximately 3.5%, which equates to $35 million. So that if the House version passes, that would take most all of the increase that is available in the FVFP. So we are waiting. I spoke with our lobbyists last night, and it seemed like the legislature surprisingly was actually leaning towards the House bill. But when I spoke to her last night, she said really it is very murky, and we honestly don't know where the legislature is going to land. We will know more after this weekend. We do have some good news with sovereign immunity. So this is Senate Bill 472 and 569. The last several years, there's been a big push to increase the sovereign immunity limits. because as a governmental agency, we are limited and capped on the amount that we have to pay out with most settlements that we have. And so there was a proposed increase that really looked like it was going to pass this year, doubling the caps from 200, 300,000 to 400, 600,000, and then putting in a CPI so that there could be increases every 5 years. But as of now, there was an amendment that was added at the last minute, which looks like it pretty much killed this bill. So it doesn't look like the sovereign immunity is going to pass this year, but it will be back next year. Then there's a bunch of deregulation bills. So there are two different versions between the Senate and the House. And after last year, and with all of the expansion of the voucher program, with districts having to compete with private schools in addition to charter schools, the question was on the table that districts should not be subject to the onerous regulations that they are now. And so there was a push on the Senate side to help to deregulate all the requirements, or a significant number of requirements that are being placed and really is truly a burden on the school districts. The House had a completely different approach in that they wanted to make sure that, and the Senate as well, that we didn't lose all accountability that was placed on school districts. So the House didn't go as far in the different deregulation recommendations. For example, one of them that was presented from our district is that the state legislature adds additional requirements over and above federal Title I requirements, dictating the number of schools that we need to allocate our funds to. And they use a date of, I believe it's, Ms. Smith, is it 2017 or 20?
Yeah, it's the 2017 school year.
And so we have to, whatever schools, whatever our limit that we used back in 2017 in terms of thresholds of schools that we allocated to, which was, what were the percentages?
So for elementary, middle, and combo schools, it was 70%, and then for high schools, 67%.
And the federal regulation is we only have to allocate to schools at 75% and above. So we would like to just go back to the federal regulation so that we can provide more funds to the most needy schools. But because of the state regulation, we have to continue to allocate to schools based on the thresholds we used back in 2017, which then waters down the per student amount that we give to our schools. So we had that as a recommendation of one of the items that could go through deregulation. It was on the Senate proposal. It was not on the House proposal. So that just gives one example of the difference. So we're waiting to see, what happens after conference, where they land on deregulation. So there was some additional with House Bill 1403 and Senate Bill 7048. There was some additional expansion of the voucher program to eliminate waiting lists for special needs. And then the Senate bill, the General Appropriations Act and the Implementation Bill, those really are tied to the budget. So once they work through the budget this weekend, they'll finalize the General Appropriations Act and Implementation Bill. Like I said, they're very interrelated. The school recognition funds do not go through the FEFP or Florida Education Finance Program. It's funded outside of FEFP, and that's where we would see it is in the General Appropriations Act. And then the implementing bills tells us exactly how we need to implement certain portions of the budget. What thresholds we have to use, and different things that might change each year.
So, and back one because you're fast.
Yeah.
The expanded vouchers thing, does that mean that schools accepting vouchers have to accept special needs students?
No, it does not. It just means that there was a limit on the number of special needs students. There was a cap.
So they could accept more, but they don't have to.
Well, this just means that there
with
used to be a cap on those that would be eligible to receive the funding, because there was a cap on the number of vouchers that could be awarded. And so now they ended up eliminating that,
Removes
that's,
the cap.
they increased the, yeah. So that then it eliminates the waiting list of those who would be eligible for the voucher. And with when you look at the private schools have the option to pick which vouchers they're going to participate in. So they can participate in just for the regular students, and then not actually accept any of the special needs.
Oh,
They have that option because it's a different voucher program.
thank you.
I wanted to go back, and I did talk about this when I was going over the FEFP, but looking at our enrollment. So when you look at this is a historical look at our enrollment. If you look at the blue bar on the bottom, that's our district enrollment. The orange is charter school, and the gray is family empowerment scholarship. So you can see with the blue that we had pretty much a steady increase in enrollment up until the pandemic in 2020, which we had a loss of about 6,000 students. We've been able to maintain and increase slightly each year, just modest increases. But we've been fortunate because the districts to our south, both Broward and Miami-Dade, are facing declining enrollment in their district-operated schools. So we've been at least able to maintain and have a slight increase. When you look at our district charter schools, they've pretty much had, steady but modest increases. This was the first year that they did have a decrease in their enrollment from 22,400 in 23 to 22,063 in 24. So that's the first year that they had a decline. And when I thought through it, I wasn't, it actually made sense because as the vouchers expand, initially we were thinking it would have more of an impact on district-operated schools, but it makes sense that vouchers would potentially have more of an impact on charter schools because those parents are already choosing to not be in a district-operated school and a public school. So they would most likely be the ones to be the first to want to leave and go to a private school. So it did make sense once I thought through it that charter schools potentially might have the vouchers might have more of an impact to charter schools than district-operated schools. And then you can see the increase of vouchers from 8,000 to 15,000. And just looking at that exponential increase in vouchers from when the program was first implemented to in 5 years, it looks, vouchers are expected to exceed the number of charter school students in just 5 years, to be 22,000, or 27, I can't even read, because it's 22,850 is what our projected voucher enrollment is going to be in 2025. So
There are no income requirements for vouchers.
there are no income requirement for vouchers any longer. That was what was waived this last legislative session.
So it's a big increase, and it looks like district and charter are almost flat between 24 and 25. Is
Right.
homeschool, is this just new kids coming into the district or homeschool kids, do you think?
I
Or do
would-
homeschool kids usually fall into this?
No, I would say
They
it's
just
just,
been moving.
it would just be schools that are now, parents that applied,
Yeah,
that were
okay.
already in private schools.
Yeah.
If they were already there, they might
So
as
they
well
just applied
they
for
just
it, and
applied
they
for
were
the
already there.
voucher.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's interesting.
And then if you look at 2024, not all the private schools had elected to participate. And so once we get all the private schools participating, that's when it's going to be saturated, and we can actually start to trend it out to see what is the increase going to be. That's what's been so hard with trending it, is it really is based on the number of schools that participate, and then the information that's provided to the parents for them to be able to apply. Now, since there's really no requirements, no eligibility requirements that are limiting the parents to apply for the funding. So the financial condition ratio is a number that's calculated and monitored by the state of Florida. And we have to make sure that our financial condition ratio does not dip below 3%. And so 3% is a minimum. That is the floor, and that's when potentially the Florida Department of Education would come in due to a financial emergency and potentially want to take over district operations. I mean, that is the potential risk. So 3% is the bare minimum where you want to be. The way it's calculated is it looks at your total revenue, and then it looks at two components of your fund balance, both the unassigned portion of the fund balance and the assigned portion of the fund balance. So the unassigned portion is the amount in our district that's set aside for board contingency to comply with our board contingency mandated set aside for reserves of 3% of our total budget. And then the assigned portion of our fund balance are things that are set aside for a specific purpose, but do have the potential to be canceled if needed. So for example, purchase orders. So it is an intention that we are going to, purchase that item, but it also there is the potential that it could be canceled. So that's why it's used, because it could potentially be used for cash flow if needed, although it is set aside for a specific purpose. So if you look at this chart, it goes all the way back to 2007 because we wanted to be able to show the Great Recession, to show how the federal funding received during the Great Recession is very, very similar to how we received the funding, the federal funding during the pandemic. So you can see Palm Beach County is the orange line. And when you're looking at the orange line from FY10 to 12, you can see that increase in fund balance, and that's based on those ERA funds that districts received. And then you could see how we slowly then spent it down until we leveled off. Then after the pandemic, you can see for the district that we bumped up again because of those federal funds. We're receiving more funds, as well as for a longer time period. So if I look out and I project to FY23, we're staying flat at about the same amount that we are now, close to that 12%. So then we'll start to see, once those federal funds sunset, we'll start to see a steady decline in the additional fund balance that we built up. One school district that I did want to highlight, we see the blue at the very top, that's Orange County. And then the other one I wanted to highlight, so Orange County does have the highest fund balance at 20%, or financial condition ratio. They do have an operating millage that they've had for a significant number of years, and they were not using that and did not want to use that for recurring funds. We do use ours, 50% of that, approximately 50% of it for teacher incentives, as well as teacher salaries. That's why we don't have, it's much harder to spend non-recurring funds than it is taking something and using it for something recurring. I do know that Orange County has changed, and that they are now setting aside some of those referendum funds for teacher incentives. The reason why they always wanted to keep it as non-recurring is because it is something you have to go back to the voters for every 4 years. The voters have to approve it every 4 years. So you are at risk every 4 years of potentially losing that funding. The only other district I wanted to highlight was the purple one, and that one is Hillsborough. Hillsborough, prior to the Great Recession, had the highest, financial condition ratio of all districts, and then they dropped very significantly down to, they were at one point the lowest. So they had some non-recurring grant funds that they received, and they had recurring salaries built into those non-recurring grants, and when those grants went away, there were not structural changes made to their budget, which caused that significant decline in their financial condition ratio. So it just goes to show how quickly you can turn from being, seeming like you're flush with funds, to then being pretty much, the lowest in the state. So it's a lesson learned that we need to be very strategic when we're looking at the one-time non-recurring funds that we have and how we spend those funds. So looking at our general fund considerations, we had our first board workshop in December where the board sets their priorities. So the board priorities are to continue to address the unfunded or the learning losses that were realized during the pandemic. We always have to make sure that we comply with all the local, state, and federal regulations, continue to maintain our facilities. We don't ever want to get back in the situation where we were, where we had a backlog of deferred maintenance and potentially deteriorating buildings. We have over 30 million square feet of buildings that represent over $9 billion in assets, and we need to make sure that we maintain them at a proper level, because that is a taxpayer investment. It also impacts the learning environment of the students, so it's very important that we continue to maintain those facilities. Now that we've built the budget up to the best practice levels, or at least the minimum of the best practice levels of what we need to have set aside for maintenance. We also need to maintain adequate budget reserves, and like I said, be very strategic in how we use those one-time funds that we were able to accumulate as a result of the ESSER funds. We still have a lot of uncertainty around enrollment, what that impact of the growth in vouchers is going to be. And that's really looking at it statewide, because since those students that participate in vouchers, most of those are not students that would have attended public schools anyway. So all they're doing is being watering down the per student funding when you look at it statewide, because you're adding in, thousands of students that never would have been funded in the past. So when you hear the state legislature saying we're funding education at record levels, at the highest amount that we ever funded in the past, you also then have to go back and look at the increase in per student funding, because if we didn't have those voucher students, we would be more in line with where we should be in terms of having the increase in per student funding align with inflation.
So we want them to be able to say, we're funding public education at the highest levels ever.
Correct.
And that's the question we ask
Right.
going forward.
Right, because, I read the letter from the Senate president, saying we're funding at record levels, and it just, it's always spin. It's I guess how you say it, but, frustrating. It's frustrating for the public when they don't understand. So we do have a lot of uncertainty around enrollment and how that's going to impact the statewide funding. Right now, I'm waiting for this weekend. I'm on pins and needles to see what happens with FRS. I'm somewhat torn. As an employee in the pension program, I would really like to have a cost of living increase, but it's also very expensive for the districts. So, waiting to see where we stand, and it also is, would be helpful from a recruitment and retention for people to know that they are going to have an increase in their investment going forward. But like I said, it's going to potentially could have a very significant impact on our budget this year. Our health premiums continue to increase. We were very fortunate that we were able to keep claims and the increase in claims trend well below the national average for 10 years. But after the pandemic, or as a result of the pandemic, we saw a significant spike in our claims, and we are not seeing them recede back to pre-pandemic levels. So we had an increase, a modest increase in our health premiums this year. We are going to need another increase in our health premiums this year in order to ensure that we can remain compliant with the state regulations of having our health fund properly funded, since we are self-insured. And then the ESSER initiatives, so the ESSER funds are sunsetting this year, and we were careful to put a minimal amount of, we tried to be very careful as to the recurring expenses that we put into the ESSER initiatives. We started even this current year shifting recurring programs back into the general fund. For example, like summer school. Summer school was one of the programs that we moved to ESSER, since there was no supplanting requirements that we had to comply with. But I brought the summer school back into our budget in FY24 to try to minimize the number of programs we needed to bring back into the general fund in order to continue to fund. So we're looking at close to $8 million in ESSER initiatives that were previously funded in the general fund that will be moving back into the general fund. Okay, and looking at how schools are funded in the state of Florida, we have what's called equalized funding. Palm Beach County is a very property-rich county in the state, and the state of Florida wanted to make sure that a student shouldn't benefit more because they're happen to be in a county that receives more property taxes. Because the way education is funded in Florida is through property taxes as well as state sales tax. And so they've created in the Constitution that all students, regardless of where they live, will receive the same amount of money with only minor changes related to cost of living. FEFP was established, or the Florida Education Finance Program, back in 1973. And it's a very detailed formula that calculates, what the per student funding is going to be, taking into consideration the types of students that you service, as well as the cost of living in the area. Basically what you do is you just take your unweighted FTE. You have different weights based on the type of student that you are, which creates what's called a weighted FTE, and then that ends up being, and you have different cost factors associated with each of the students that equate to that weighted FTE. You take that weighted FTE, and then you multiply that times the student funding, and that's how it ends up being calculated. When you look at how we're funded, like I mentioned, it's primarily, education is primarily funded in the state of Florida through local property taxes and state sales tax. So when you look statewide at the total composition of how education is funded, 46% of education statewide is coming from local property taxes, and 54% is coming from state funding. When you look at Palm Beach County, because we are a property-rich county, 68% of our funding comes from local property taxes, where 32% comes from state funding. So that's the way the formula works. In order to equalize the funding, if you're receiving more in local money, then you'll receive less in state, so that you receive the same amount per student statewide. And why you might hear sometimes that Palm Beach County is a donor county, it's because, more of our funding, we end up getting less in state funding because we're receiving so much in local funding. The primary drivers of the state general revenue, which is where education is funded from, is state sales tax. State sales tax makes up 76% of the state budget. And when you look at the property values, our property values, our required local effort, the millage rate that we charge our constituents is set by the state legislature. So that is something that, as part of this whole budget conferencing process that the state legislature is working through this weekend, they're also going to set the required local effort that school districts will be allowed to charge. And then, if it's not set by the state legislature, it's capped by the state legislature. We have the portion at the top, the 3.2 mils is what is set by the state legislature, and then the local portion is the amount that's capped. So we cannot levy any more for the discretionary operating or the local capital improvement than we already do. And that additional operating millage has to go to the voters and be approved by the voters every 4 years in order to continue. In looking at school property values, a lot of times people will say the property values have increased so significantly, you're obviously getting increased funding. And so the school property values and the increase in school property values does not align with the per student funding, because that is set by the state. And then it's just adjusted, your state funding is adjusted to equalize it out to whatever the per student increase is going to be. So this year it's going to be on average a 2.75% increase in per student funding. You saw that we had significant increases in 23 and 24 of 22%, and then nearly 16%. The projection for 2025, and this is for school property values, which is different than the county values, we're looking at based on what was released in January from EDR, we're looking at a 3.5% increase in property values.
Do you remember what last year EDR said the increase would be in January of last year? And then you ended up getting almost 16. I was wondering how close their
I
projections
mean, they're
are.
usually pretty close. I want to say it was around 12%.
Okay. I just think 3.5 is really low. I mean, when you
Yep.
see all the cranes and things going on in Palm Beach County, that just,
And it is
but-
lower than the county values because of the way the values are calculated and what we have limits on versus
right.
versus the county. Because I think the county increase isn't it 5%? Or is it higher?
yeah, no, for the current year, we were about 12%, where yours is at 16, I think.
But for 2025, I thought
For
your projection.
2025, I think we have a projection right now of around 5 or 8%.
That's what I thought, that yours is a
Yeah,
little higher
and, yeah, so
than-
that's
than-
why, yeah.
than what ours
Mhm.
is. And when you go out the next 5 years, the highest increase is 5%. So we're not going to see double-digit increases. We're not seeing any declines, but we're not seeing it does not appear we're going to be seeing double-digit increases
Right, yeah.
anytime soon.
3.5 just seems low in my mind, but
Yeah,
yeah, I hope so.
yeah.
Yeah. Like,
And this is just a chart of what I mentioned earlier. We have the blue is the change in taxable value, the percentage change in taxable value compared to our percentage change in per student funding. So you could see that, it really doesn't align. There were a few years from 14 to 20, where it somewhat was, at least on, at least trending consistently much lower, I guess. But then you can see the difference in, when we were receiving 22% increase in property values, we had a 5% increase in per student funding. No, and I can say that where we do see the increase is in the referendum. So that operating millage we have, we do recognize the full amount of the increase within there. That's local, right. This goes through the FEFP formula, so you can see for Palm Beach County, looking at what our FTE is, our unweighted FTE, which when you look at our unweighted FTE includes voucher students, district-operated schools, charter schools, as well as vouchers. You take that times the average cost factor, because it's a different weight whether you're a K-3 student versus whether you're a high school student. So there are different weights applied, and whether you're a English of a language learner student versus a special needs student. There's different weights for each type of student. That program cost factor is applied to come up with a weighted FTE. That weighted FTE is then multiplied times the base student allocation, which is also increased by the comparable wage factor, which is the factor that's applied for cost of living in order to get your base student funding. And then from there, you would add on the additional, what we call categoricals, so educational enrichment, safe schools, mental health, ESC guarantee is for special needs, DJJ special supplemental funding. Those are all categoricals we receive that have to be used for a specific purpose. There used to be a lot more than in the prior year, but some of those categoricals, those set-aside fundings, were moved into that base funding. And so after all of that, you end up getting, what is your allocation that you're going to receive in Palm Beach County. Looking at the most recent Census Bureau data, 2022 information is not going to be available until May, but as of 2021, which is the most current, Florida ranks 47th in the nation in terms of per pupil spending. The average across the country is 14,347. In Palm Beach, or really Florida, we're at 10,400. So well below the national average, and 47th in the country is quite dismal. I also mentioned that we have not been keeping pace. The increase in per-student funding has not been keeping pace with inflation. Looking in 2024, for the per-student funding would need to be $11,239 to keep pace with inflation, going back and starting with 2008, which is where we started to see those significant declines in per-student funding. So we
What's significant to me is that how far below average we are. And that,
looking at the states that are, so only Mississippi, Arizona, Utah, and Idaho are the only states that fund less than Palm Beach. So,
Heather, quick question. Is the FES voucher going to impact that? So the money that's going to be going to these private school, is that going to impact that spend and therefore the increase in total amount spent on public education?
I don't believe so, because we receive an annual survey each year from the Census Bureau that we have to complete, the school district has to complete. So I don't believe that it would include, that they're going to be sending that out to private schools. They might be doing that, but I don't think it would be included in the public school expenditures, but I'm not positive. Yeah. All right, so our district, we have a $5 billion budget in Palm Beach County. We're the 10th largest district in the country. We have over 160,000 students in district-operated schools. We are a large district. Districts operate very different in the state of Florida. They operate by county instead of by city or town. So that's why we're so large when you compare us. Five of the 10 largest districts are in the state of Florida. And that's because we're county-based. When you look at how our funds are allocated, so we have a $5 billion budget, 50% of that is general fund. Almost 30% of that is capital projects. We have, grant funds make up, about 10%, and then we have the rest is debt service. And looking at our general fund budget, the bulk of our budget, so 76% of our budget, is directly related to schools. So 50% of our district-operated budget is for district-operated schools. 11% of our budget is for district, comes directly from the referendum, and that 50% of that referendum, that I say referendum district at 11%, approximately 50% of that is for teacher supplements, as well as teacher raises that we were able to give this current year because of the increase in the property values. We also fund a quarter of that approximately is for fine art teachers, art, music, PE, choice, and career academy teachers. And then the remaining quarter is for mental health initiatives. We have a school behavioral health position at every single school at the district, as well as safety and security at school sites. We are required by law to share that referendum with charter schools, so about 1% goes to charter schools when you're looking at the total district budget. 8% of our budget is gets passed through to charter schools, and 5% is passed through now. It's the McKay and FES does not get passed through in the same manner of charter schools. The charter school funding comes directly to the district, and then the district pays the charter schools. The McKay and FES is included when you look at our FEFP budget. McKay and FES is included within that Palm Beach County total FEFP budget, but the state pays the private schools directly or puts it into a student education fund. That money does not filter through the district, but it is reflected within our budget. It's a non-cash item, but it is reflected within our budget. About 8% of our budget is spent on departments, so that would include departments like transportation and maintenance, as well as other overhead. 4% of our budget is for non-K-12 activities, so our aftercare program, our adult program, our community school program, which is for adult type activities. So everything that's non our core of K-12. 1% of our budget is spent on property insurance. 2% of our budget is on utilities, phone and data. 1% is employee leave payouts. 5% is our capital maintenance transfer. So there are items within capital we're allowed to use capital money for certain things that don't qualify to be in the capital projects fund. Tradespeople, maintaining our buildings, not custodial staff, but any employees that are maintaining our infrastructure, whether it's our physical infrastructure or our technology infrastructure, different software. So those are all allowed to be funded through the capital projects funding, but we have to transfer the money into the general fund in order to pay for them, because they can't be recorded within a capital projects fund. So we track them separately for auditing purposes. And then the last 3% is the contingency reserve, which is what we're mandated by our board policy to keep set aside within our fund balance, and increases each year based on the increase in revenue. So the bulk of in looking at our schools, because the schools is the bulk of our budget, the schools are all set up by an allocated or budgeted based on an allocation formula. It's based on a staffing formula using enrollment, and then for all of our basic teachers, as well as our special needs teachers, and as well as our English language learner teachers as well. We do a projection. We have a planning department that projects what the enrollment is going to be for the upcoming year. That's for all of our regular enrollment. When we're projecting for the next year for our special needs and our English language learner students, we use the current students that we have when we pull the information in at the end of January. And then we use the projected enrollment from planning, which takes into considerations any growth of new developments, takes into consideration births and deaths, and they have a whole calculation and system that they use to project by school. That's how we then, the enrollment that we use in order to calculate the school-based allocation. That school-based allocation was released to schools on February 20th. So just, I guess that was last week. Time seems to travel, but it goes quickly. But that was Tuesday of last week, released school budgets. So now we have the principals going through reviewing, making sure that they agree with the projected enrollment from the planning department, because maybe there was some sort of development that the planning department might have missed. So that does give the schools time to ask us to look and possibly adjust their enrollment. We do our best to try to make some changes within the allocation, for those schools that have higher. We now use direct certification percentage, because when you do the teacher allocation, you're not ever going to calculate exactly 11 teachers or exactly 10 teachers. It's going to be 11 teachers, 11.5 teachers. Well, you can't give 11.5 teachers or 11.25. So we have to decide, when are we going to round up and give them the next teacher, or when are we going to round down? So when we're doing that rounding, we take into consideration their direct certification percentage. So that's the main allocation to schools. The most significant part of our budget is all allocation driven. We have very strict class size mandates in the state of Florida. Our class size requirements are at a school-wide level because we are considered a choice district. So that's why our formulas are We have to comply with class size mandates, so our allocation is driven by those state mandates. And all schools have to be treated the same, regardless of any additional funding that they receive. So that's the main school allocation that they receive. On top of that funding, there's vocational teachers that are allocated to middle and high schools. There's choice and magnet positions that are allocated. We have a summer program for ESE students primarily, and then other just miscellaneous school programs that are allocated on top of that base allocation budget. We have state categoricals, which I've mentioned. So I've listed out all the different state categoricals. If they have BSA next to them in parentheses, that means it used to be a set aside, a categorical, and then last year, or this current year that we're in now, the legislature rolled that into the base student allocation, but still is requiring us to track it even though it's been rolled into the base student allocation. So it was rolled into the base student allocation, but it doesn't mean that we can just spend the money for whatever purpose we want to pay it for. When you look at teacher pay, for example, the teacher pay categorical has to be set aside. It's a portion within the base student allocation to be set aside for teacher pay. I guess to guarantee that we're not going to use the BSA, what's in the BSA, since it used to be completely unrestricted for anything we want. The state is saying you have to at least use this amount for teacher pay. A categorical we receive is for advanced placement courses, ACE courses, industry certification programs, IB programs, and the money that we receive that schools earn based on the pass rate, we have to make sure that we allocate, and we do 80% of that back to the school that generated the money, and that money stays with the school and carries over each year. Trying to say, we have the mental health allocation as well as safe schools. The teacher classroom supply money has been moved into the base student allocation, but then the state is going to tell us in the implementation bill how much money we have to pay out each year. So it's going to be up to $300, but we're going to wait and see, and that will be in the bill because the state will tell us what is the per teacher amount we need to allocate. So then looking at the part of the pie chart related to the referendum. The referendum in FY24 generated $319 million. There was $25 million of carryover money that we had. The reason for that carryover money in FY23 is we had such a significant increase in property values that we weren't anticipating. So we had a significant carryover of one-time funds in the referendum. So this year, when you look at any changes that we had within the referendum, we added $35 million to a teacher pay increase, which allowed our district to give teachers the highest raise that they've received, from what I can remember of a 7% recurring increase. So the way we were able to do that was to use that increase in the referendum in order to help fund part of that increase. You can see the breakout, so of the total amount received that the district receives of $281 million, we are spending now $288 million. So if you look at the recurring, we're actually spending more than what we're receiving in recurring increases. But I did plan for that because I knew that there was going to be an increase in property values next year. So we'll be able to absorb that increase next year. And we can wait and see what the actual increase ends up being in the property values. We do have that one-time money, and so we're looking at different projects that we can do that are going to be non-recurring in order to be able to spend that carryover funds, because we do have to track it. There is an advisory committee for these referendum funds. We meet quarterly, and so we report out, or I report out, how the actual expenses that are spent within the referendum. So our school budgets were released on February 20th. We did build into our school-based budget allocation or projected enrollment an increase of approximately 1,000 students, which is more than the, which is a 1,500 student difference from what DOE was projecting. So I'm waiting to see if DOE recognized the increase that we believe that we're going to have in district-operated schools. So when I get the detailed run of the budget, I'll be able to see if that additional increase in enrollment was approved. But we did build the school budgets with an increase of 1,000 students, and so that means that there are additional teachers and additional funding that have been allocated to schools based on an increase of 1,000 students in district-operated schools.
And the schools confirmed that projection?
Yeah, the schools, when they received their budgets on February 20th, then they have the projected enrollment number in there for them to review. And mostly schools, I can tell you, it's very rare for a school to come back to me and tell me that their enrollment is too high. It has happened, but normally they're coming back and they're saying the enrollment is too low, and, because they're looking at the rounding as well, and they know if they only need one more student in order to round up to the next teacher, we have to be careful. So I do work with schools from the time budgets are released in February all the way through to count day, which is the 11th day of school, where we go and we adjust funding based on the actual students that are enrolled. I work with principals throughout that time period that if they have additional registrations, that we will rerun the allocation and allocate them teachers contingent on count day, because it's so difficult to hire teachers. I don't want them waiting until August and then they can't hire anybody. So we work with them throughout that period. And then we also do monitor to see if there are any that are over-enrolled and make sure to work to make sure they're setting aside those teachers and holding them. Because we never have a problem placing people come count day. It's just moving them. It's almost musical chairs, moving them to where they need to be. So there are no changes, or were no changes in the school allocation this year. The only change that we're going to have in FY25 is all of the ESSER positions, so it's about 374 school-based ESSER positions that have been frozen for next year. So schools and principals were warned from the beginning. Those positions were set aside for a finite period of time because they were there to provide intervention and build capacity to try to help close that gap of that learning loss of students, but they were never intended to stay. We made sure that the number of teachers that we built within the ESSER grant was going to be enough that we could easily reabsorb them back into the district budget. Our normal attrition with teachers is about 1,100 each year, so that we knew that we would easily be able to reabsorb those teachers back into vacant teacher positions within the general fund. We always wanted to make sure that it was manageable, that we had a plan once the grant did sunset. With department budgets, we're going through department budgets now. We're having meetings with the superintendent starting over the next couple weeks. So at our next meeting, I'll be able to give an update on the departments. But I do not expect that we're going to have any increases in positions on the department side other than in capital. So I do expect to have some increases in some capital funded positions just due to the increase in the capital projects. We have a lot of small projects that are starting to be implemented, and so we need additional staff for oversight and then we also are that capital maintenance transfer where we transfer money from the capital projects fund into the general fund to cover those capital related costs. We do have a lot of maintenance personnel within our general funded budget, and we do need to continue to maintain our buildings. And so it is possible that we might be looking at adding some positions within that area as well. But within our general fund, I don't anticipate having any increases in positions other than potentially some department-based ESSER positions. We're still working through, because the board gave us direction that they didn't want the departments to be able to keep positions if schools were being required to lose all of their positions. So we're working through what changes we can make within our department budgets to minimize the impact of any department-based positions and minimize the amount that have to be retained, if any. So I have Ms. Evans, she's on virtually, and she was going to walk through the capital plan.
Good morning, everyone, and I'm happy to give Ms. Frederick a break. She's been talking for a long time this morning. The capital budget, we started with a capital plan. So every year we're required to adopt a financially feasible, and those words are in statute, financially feasible 5-year capital plan. We started doing a 10-year plan when we did the last sales tax. It was a 10-year tax. We actually did an 11-year capital plan, shrunk it down to 10, and we've just kept it at 10 years, which is more than required, but it's very helpful. And I don't think anyone on staff would go back. It's a lot of work, but it lets us do additional planning. So our board sees that every year. And as it's reviewed, projects are added or deleted and changed based on the current conditions of the schools and the current priorities of the school board. Capital funds are used to purchase, build and maintain buildings, equipment. We're limited in software. It has to be enterprise-wide. Things like our main financial and HR systems, student information systems, big systems that are required to run the district. Instructional software is not allowed here. So it includes not just new projects and equipment, but also the planned maintenance, which is what Ms. Frederick talked about earlier, that's transferred to the general fund every year. There were some significant changes in 24. We added in, actually we moved up a West Area Elementary School, which is an elementary school to be built in the Arden complex, in the Arden community. We added a phase 2 for Roosevelt full service and Delray full service. We've continued to increase and expedite security projects as needed. And the biggest change, I think, in the capital plan this year was the requirement that we share capital outlay millage with charter schools on a per student basis. So that is new. It's being ramped up, and gradually we had to do 20% of the payment this year. It'll be 40% in FY25, then 60, 80, and up to 100% eventually. So that's currently our charter schools. We tend to say it's about 10%, 11%. It's a big chunk of money that's going to charter schools, and that has a dramatic impact on the capital plan. Next slide. Okay, so the capital planning considerations. First of all, we look at enrollment projections every year. What's needed? What do we need? Do we need more schools? Do we need to add more space? Example, Arden, we plan to build that school, and that development's growing faster than we expected and more students than we expected. So we had to move that school up. Academic programs sometimes necessitate changes to facilities. We always try to look at the condition of the facilities. The old saying is they don't make it like they used to. Gosh, does it apply to air conditioning systems and roofs? And you've probably seen that with your own home. It's not unique to school districts, but things don't tend to last quite as long as they used to. Market conditions, and that's a huge impact for us this year. Inflation, when you look at the inflation numbers that are quoted, the numbers we're seeing on building materials and construction and maintenance is significantly higher than what you're seeing at the grocery store. It's been, and any of you that have had any work done in your home have seen that. The prices have gone up exponentially. We also look at revenue forecasts for the sales tax and property tax to see if we can expedite projects or if things need to be moved back every year. Legislative changes can have significant impacts. Some of the things that Ms. Frederick talked about, we're certainly monitoring there. And last year was when we had to start sharing capital outlay millage with charters, so they can have significant impacts. And then, of course, we look at the board priorities. What is the board's direction for how we're spending our money? Next slide, please. So I kind of went through this already. These are the changes. These are the changes that went to the board. We did make some additional changes to the capital plan, to our capital budget, or we're in the process of doing that. We went to the board in December and we changed the funding so that those two, the Roosevelt and Delray full service phase 2 projects, as well as North Tech River Reach Prep and phase 1 would be borrowed in a taxable COPS issue in, it's probably going to be early 2025. It depends on when we have final construction numbers and we know how much to borrow. So we'd be borrowing for that as well as for the school and art. So we told the board that we plan to borrow for those schools coming forward. The board acknowledged that in a resolution. So as soon as we're ready, we'll be bringing the actual borrowing back to the school board. And one of the things we're working on right now is the sales tax. Our current sales tax is scheduled to expire. It was supposed to be end of 2026. We're expecting it will sunset a year early. There was a requirement that if you met a certain threshold by any year on September 1st, that you would end it early. And we are anticipating that would happen. So we are working on another sales tax. We're starting that work. We're currently updating the facility condition assessment. We have a preliminary report, just high level, and they still need to go out and do site-by-site visits, but we're working on that. The school board has already approved the ballot language. That happened earlier this month, actually. And we're in queue for the county to do the ministerial approval of that ballot language. And I think the latest is early April for that. We have already requested a performance audit. That was another legal change from the legislature is if we have a referendum that is not exactly the same as what we had before, then you are required to contact OPAGA, which is an agency at the state. They hire a CPA firm to do a performance audit covering all the areas to be encompassed in that referendum. So we've already contacted OPAGA. They're in the process of selecting a CPA firm, and we expect to hear from them soon to go through that audit. And then once it's completed, we're required to post it on our website. And then looking forward to the general election, which will be November 5th. So they changed the capital plan in FY25. We will be adding in another elementary school to be built in the area around the Westlake community. We already have land that was donated, and it was just a matter of when we had enough students that it made sense to build a school. So that is being added in the FY25, the upcoming capital plan. We're also probably going to end up with two versions of the capital plan, one with the sales tax and one without. And late breaking news, we figured out we probably need to do a 12-year capital plan because the referendum would be for another 10 years. So we'd want to include the full 10 years in the capital plan. So we may take our required to be 5 years, used to doing 10 and bumping it out to 12 to be able to encompass the full picture of what that sales tax would look like. And the sales tax, this is just to give you a summary. The Sales Tax Oversight Committee met and just reviewed the information through December 31st. So this is an overview. We've collected over 1.1 billion versus the projection of 876 million for the same time frame. That's 126% of the projection for that period of time. And we already collected 82% of the total receipts in 68% of the time. And that gets into the reason that sunset provision is triggered. It is coming in faster than projected. The expenses through December 31st are 689 million with 114 million in purchase orders. Those numbers have both gone up, obviously, since December 31st. But that brings total committed at 603 million as of December 31st. One of the things that we look at is the Council of Great City Schools. We're an active participant in that organization. And they created a report that came out back in 2014, but it was really good. And it talked about how we need to provide adequate funding for our facilities and gave us some guidelines that we should be spending 2 to 4% of the building replacement value on maintenance every year. And they also recommend that we do a facility condition assessment every 5 years. And that's the one that I talked about a couple slides ago that's underway. So we have seen an increase in our square footage in addition to just normal, well, I wouldn't say normal increase in replacement values. Building replacement values have grown exponentially, and that's a good proxy for increased costs. So we are looking at that in conjunction with the experts that are doing our facility condition assessment right now. And this next slide is something that our facilities department has come up with. This is the logic of how you manage a building over its life cycle, that we do a refresh every 10 to 12 years, a big renewal, which we've been doing a lot of those lately. That's what we're using the current sales tax for, is to do those renewals and to catch up on deferred maintenance. That should be about halfway through the life cycle at 24 to 26 years. You do another refresh in another 10 to 12 years, and then possibly a replacement or a renovation at 50, 53 years. That's something that we're working on, how to implement that, to really look at the total life cycle of our schools. And I know Mr. Sanchez is on the phone. If I misspoke, please chime in and let me know. But I think I got it. Let's keep going. He's on. He'll interrupt if he needs to. This is the list of construction projects that was in the FY24 plan that's been previously adopted. As I mentioned, we'll be adding an elementary school in the Westlake area into this list, and we'll probably drop a few off as they're completed. The one listed as Boca down under new schools, the third one under new schools, Boca Raton area elementary school. That's the Blue Lake Elementary School that's opened. So we'll probably drop that off. Hopefully that project is completely closed out in time. So this is the list of projects. And then the next tab is debt service. And this is my, as Ms. Frederick knows, I always say this is my favorite chart. I manage the debt and investment for the school district, and I also work on the capital budget. So this is a really good picture to look at long term. And we're tracking the vertical bars, the beige or gray bars, is our existing debt service. That's debt we've already issued. And you can see how the value of the principal and interest payments are dropping. We had at one point everything done by 2032, but we've started building again. We built some new schools, a new elementary, middle, and high school, and modernized a few. So now it's going out to 2040. And then we have some planned borrowings coming in the capital plan, and that's the blue. And then the red, I'd say vertical or slanting bars, that's showing the red bar is 50% of the 1.5 mils. And that's our policy dictates we should use no more than that for debt service. The green bar is the 50% of the 2 mils. And for those of you that have been, if you've been around for any length of time, you know the state used to allow us to levy 2 mils, and that was reduced to 1.5 several years ago. So we're looking at that red bar and seeing where it is, and that gives us an idea of how much capacity we have to borrow in the future to replace schools, to build new schools, because we usually borrow for them. And that's really important to keep in mind going forward. We do have a lot of schools that will hit 50 years in 2037, 38. Again, those of you that have been in Palm Beach County for a long time, remember we had a bond referendum back in 1986 and 87 and built a lot of schools. They're going to hit 50, and then we'll have to reevaluate those. So we're purposely making sure we have lots of capacity for work that may be needed in the long term. And then the facilities projects, now we're going through the different sections of the capital plan just to give you an overview of what's included. The facility renewal and maintenance projects, the facility renewals were what was included in the sales tax. That was a lot of deferred maintenance, getting schools caught up and bringing them up to the level they should be in. That's here. We're also dealing with the ongoing maintenance. We are trying to address all those deferred maintenance projects and to make sure our schools are in good shape. And we want to make sure we keep them that way. The biggest challenge in this area really is cost escalation. The prices are going up exponentially. To try to make sure that we complete all those facility renewal projects, we went to the school board back in June of 22 and the sales tax oversight committee in September of 22. And we made decisions to move some of the large facility renewal projects, 4 of them, from sales tax into a borrowing. We also moved the Roosevelt Full Service Rivier Beach Prep into a borrowing, which freed up sales tax dollars so that we can make sure we're completing every project on that list. that phrase that we use, promises made, promises kept, is so important. We want to make sure we're completing every project on that referendum list. We also have security projects that we continue to work on. Things like the bi-directional amplifiers, which is what allows radios to work well from like the fire department, police department, to be able to communicate with people inside the schools, guard houses, fencing, cameras, card readers, intrusion alarms, etc. And then we get into technology, and we break that into a couple of categories. We have educational technology. They really work in doing the classroom setup. So that's the big flat panels that we put in all the schools that was funded through the sales tax. Have been so helpful when we had to deal with virtual learning, and it's really enhanced the educational experience in our schools to have those there. Computer refresh, this number has gone up substantially because now we're to a 1-to-1 ratio, and we need to make sure that we have extra Chromebooks, because unfortunately children will close the Chromebook with the pencil in it and then crack the screen. So we need to have extras on hand when those go out to repair. So we've had to increase just the sheer volume of Chromebooks that we have on hand at every school. And then lots of other technology projects, led by the infrastructure and cybersecurity, network security, and making sure we have all the equipment needed to run all of the computers in the schools. And the rest of it comes down to vehicles. So we have our school buses, maintaining those, operating those, contracted transportation, police cars, vehicles for our maintenance department to get around to the schools. We fund all that from the capital budget. Equipment such as TV studios, furniture, desks and chairs, musical instruments, all of that's included in the capital budget. We're also allowed to fund the property and flood insurance from our capital budget. And we do have reserves, the sales tax reserves that are there to expedite projects as needed and to deal with cost escalation. And we also have reserves in our capital contingency. Those numbers tend to be higher the further out. When you get to year 8, 9, and 10 in the capital plan, the reserves are higher because we haven't yet identified all the specific needs that will be needed across all the other areas of the capital plan. So if you ever dig into it and look and you see big numbers at the end, they never stay that big. They shrink as we get closer and closer to the time that we're spending the dollars, and we have more knowledge of exactly what's needed. Charter schools, we did have to share a capital outlay with them this year. It was partially funded by the state, but we also had to send, I believe it was about $7 million out this year. That will double next year we're at 20% this year, 40% next, 60, 80, up to 100. So we'll see that number increase substantially. We're expecting in the next capital plan over the 10-year window, it's about $600 million total that we're sending out to charter schools based on enrollment projections that we have right now. So the big challenges we have is, again, sharing that money with charter schools that we hadn't planned on doing in the past. The sales tax ending a year early, and it's been used to fund security, vehicles, transportation, and those facility renewals. And we do still need to continue doing that. The decrease of that 600 million for charters, along with the cost escalation and just the sheer volume of some of the work. I mean, it's 30 million square feet. There's a lot more computers than we ever had before. Insurance costs are rising. All those things are going on. And that's really led us to come back and consider, and the board has approved going to the voters to extend that, the half penny the school district is levying. With that, I'll turn it back over to Ms. Frederick. But before we do that, are there any questions on the capital budget?
Yes, I have a question, Leanne. The one where the state is now sharing capital millage with the charter schools, does that capital millage stay with the charter school so they have had a contribution to the building they own?
They can use that money to make rent payments or lease payments on their building. If they own their building, and there are a couple, but not very many that own the building. Most of the buildings are owned by a charter school holding company, and the individual schools are using it to make rental payments. But if they own their building, they can use it certainly to make improvements, to make debt service payments if they borrow to build it. They can also buy computers. They can do anything that we do with our capital budget.
And if that school does end up closing, anything that's in the name of the school would revert back to the school district. But like Ms. Evans said, there are very few schools that actually own their own buildings. It's usually owned by the management company, and they're just paying a lease payment. So there wouldn't be anything that would revert back to the district or the taxpayers. It's not actually an asset of the taxpayers. All right, so now the last section is getting into the special revenue fund. It's starting with ESSER and then all our other funds. So for our special revenue fund, including ESSER, we received in FY24 about $400 million in federal programs. You can see that ESSER is about 50% of the total special revenue budget. The title is about 26%. IDEA is about 13%. So those are, when you don't consider ESSER, our title and IDEA are our two biggest grant programs. We're not including in here food service, but food service would be the third large grant program. And then 10% is a whole bunch of other grants. Probably, I think we're at close to 300 different state and local grants, federal, state, and local grants that comprise that 10%. In looking at ESSER, so our ESSER funds end sunset September 30th, 2024 is the official end date of the ESSER federal funds. Our goal is to have all of our funds expended by June 30th of 2024. We didn't want to have positions funded for 3 months of the next year. We wanted to be done, have a clean end by June 30th. I don't expect that the charter schools will be fully expended by June 30th. We started this month notifying our charter schools. We sent out a letter to the board chairs to let them know the amount of money that they have remaining, and please spend it. Our charter schools have about $20 million that they haven't spent, which is pretty significant for the number of charter schools that we have. If the charter schools don't want the funds, we gave them the option that they can give those funds back to the school district, but we've put them on notice, and we're going to continue to communicate with them because we want them to spend the funds. And if they're not going to spend them, at least let us spend them. But we need to make sure that we're providing them proper notification, and we started that in the month of February to give them time. So I'm going to go through on the next slide, what are the items within ESSER that we have to, are recurring that need to be moved back into the general fund. So in addition to ESSER, we do have a small grant program, Children's Services Strong Minds Grant. That's, a little over $1 million, and that has been a program of the Children's Services Council that we've had for many years. Children's Services Council is what they're calling reimagining the supports and programs that they're providing to districts as well as other organizations. And that was just a way of them saying, we're not going to give you this money anymore. That was a nice way of them saying that. So it is going to impact 7 positions. They at least made sure to notify us early. So we knew about this more than 2 years ago. So the early childhood department has been planning for the loss of these funds. 3 technical assistant specialists will be accessed. They have been notified, so they have been looking for other positions. 4 of the positions will be placed in existing vacancies that the department has. The service that this program was providing, it was really just more of a compliance-based program. And Children's Services Council wants to get away from compliance-based programs and really get back more into those programs that are providing direct supports and benefits to students. So I believe it's Children's Services Council is still going to be providing this service. So it's not that this is going away, it's just not going to be provided by the school districts. In looking at the ESSER funds, So this is the total budget is over, since FY '21, is close to $600 million. You can look at the amount that's unspent for ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 have been closed out. The charter schools have $2.8 million in unspent funds. The district had $96,000 in unspent funds. And those were purely, the district unspent funds were purely related to timing, as to, there was a credit that was received back and it was too late for us to make adjustments, and, an item that was disallowed. So they were all timing related for the district unspent funds. The majority was in charter schools, and why we're making an effort with the charter schools now and early to remind them of the funds they have to get them to be able to spend their funds. We are spending the bulk of our funding. When you look at ESSER, it's a lot of money. It really, truly is a lot of money to spend. And you wanted to be careful to not spending on recurring expenditures. A lot of the districts that are having issues with the sunset of ESSER put a lot of positions in there. And so now they need to bring a lot of those positions back into the general fund. We only put enough positions within ESSER that we knew we could reabsorb into vacancies we knew we were going to have. So if you look at our spending as of 2023, a little over 35% of it is related to unfinished learning. 20% of it, and those are all like academic-based programs. 20% of it is for safe operation of schools. So that was when, had a lot of custodial supplies and the cleaning of schools. That was a lot of what the safe operation of schools included. All of the custodial supplies, we did have just a general increase as a result of COVID in custodial supplies. So that increase was one of those expenses that was moved back into the general fund in 2024. Safe operation of schools, about 22% of it was spent on emergency disaster pay, so bonuses for teachers and staff for recruitment and retention. 4% of it was spent on technology. There was a requirement that was placed on these funds by the Florida Department of Ed that a certain portion of it be spent on technology. So that's why 4% was spent on technology. We already had a plan within our capital plan to get to one-to-one devices of laptops. So we really, prior to COVID, we did have to move it up because we did have a longer runway in order to get to the one-to-one devices, but we already had it built into our capital plan. So we didn't need to utilize our ESSER funds for getting to the one-to-one devices. There's 5% of it is spent on indirect cost, which is allowed by the federal government. 10% of that is passed through to charter schools. And then just like DOE mandated a certain percentage be spent on technology, they also mandated a certain percent be spent on social emotional. And really the portion of that funding was was for truancy and making sure that students were coming back to school, having a team follow up when students weren't coming to school, where are they? And if they weren't coming to our school, ensuring that they're going to another school, whether it's in Palm Beach County or somewhere else within the country. So that was really the purpose of the social emotional funds, and that was, again, a mandate from Florida Department of Ed. So in looking at that, we were spending about, close to $150 million a year in ESSER funds, and after where we are right now, what is the funding cliff for ESSER? And at the time I did the presentation, it was $8.6 million. I have been able to, that is reduced down to now $7.9 million based on efforts within the departments, and we're still working on reducing that further. But it's broken up into two components, positions and non-salary. So when you look at the positions, the original impact was potentially going to be $1.3 million. That's the elimination of 374 school-based positions totaling about $30 million. The intention from the start of ESSER was to always move those teachers back into vacant teacher positions. Our vacancy rate is higher. And it is coming down, but during COVID, it's been very hard to fill our teacher positions. So we have more than enough vacancies to absorb the 374 positions. In addition to that, in addition to the school-based positions, there were 46 department-based positions. Of the 46 department positions, there were originally 12 positions that departments were requesting to keep. One of those was in my department. And when we presented to the board members said they didn't feel that it was fair that all the positions were being eliminated at the school level, and that any positions were going to be allowed to be maintained at the department level, and asked us to please go back to relook at the positions and look to see, what changes could be made. So we are working hard on that. We haven't finalized it, but for example, in my department, I have a retirement, so I'm able to take the position that I had funded within the ESSER and move them into that retirement. So that will be the reduction from, will be one of the reductions. Teaching and learning was able to consolidate, 2 of their positions into one, into 2. They were going to have 3 positions. They decided they only needed to have 2. So that was the reduction from 12 to 11. And I'm working and then within academics, they have a grant available that they'll be able to fund one of the positions from. And within HR, there's a position that they're able to give up, as well as, and then the chief of staff is able to give up some non-salary. So I have each of the chiefs working with their departments to minimize the financial impact through either cuts in positions or non-salary. So as of now, we're down to an impact of $600,000, but I do expect that to be reduced even further. The non-salary impact is $7.3 million, and that's related to instructional software, as well as additional specific ESSER initiatives. So the instructional software was software that we had previously, from the majority that we had previously, that we shifted into the ESSER funds. So iReady is something that we already had. We had a version of No Red Ink. We're funding Navigate 360. And since there was no supplanting requirements with ESSER, we moved all instructional materials into ESSER. So those are ones we're just moving back. GoGuardian was something that was a result of ESSER. It's a way to monitor the activity on the computers. Since during the pandemic, we had to go very quickly to one-to-one devices, we realized we needed a monitoring software, so that is the GoGuardian, and so that is something that we need to continue to maintain. What I have in parentheses is the year that we need to start funding it. So iReady, because some of these have multiple years within the subscription, so iReady is something we have to fund in FY25. No Red Ink, we don't have to fund until FY26. Same with Navigate 360. We're not going to be using Navigate 360. We're going to be using a different product, but that won't be until 26. Possibly implementing, if we get the product sooner, possibly in 2025. And that's the Navigate 360 is for mental health initiatives and threat assessments. So that one is necessary for state mandates. And then GoGuardian, we don't have to start funding that, and that will not come up for renewal until 2027. Within the ESSER initiatives, there's a total of $5.3 million, and they include the EPI teachers. So like I said, our vacancies are higher than what they were pre-COVID. So the HR department has been working diligently on thinking outside the box as to different ways that we can recruit teachers for our students to eliminate the number of vacancies. EPI, their resource for international teachers. And so so that's the cost for EPI to recruit those positions and the work that they perform. We have different health room supplies. All the custodial supplies were already moved in 2024, but we have different supplies within the health room that we will be reabsorbing. Expansion of the ACT and College Board. So we expanded the number of students where the district would pay for them to take the ACT as well as the AP test. And so we want to continue that. So we saw good results with that, and that's a program that we want to continue. We also, because recruitment and retention was so difficult during COVID, we used to charge employees, new hires for fingerprinting. And because recruitment and retention, recruitment was so difficult, we used ESSER funds to pay for fingerprinting of employees, and so that's something we want to continue to do because recruitment continues to be a challenge. Community field trip experiences. We are looking, that is something that was an initiative with COVID, give students at certain grade levels within the district access to certain experiences that are outlined and guardrails are provided by the school district, but making sure that every student has access to be able to go to the theater, be able to go to the Kravis Center, be able to go and experience the Norton Museum. And so we have certain experiences laid out by grade level so to ensure that every student within that grade level is able to attend. And we are looking for grants to help offset the cost of those community experiences. But we've received very positive feedback from the students that participated in these experiences, as well as the schools and the community. And so we have been getting, a lot of organizations that are willing to help cover the cost of transportation to get students to be able to participate. We've also had to increase our costs related to marketing. Because we were concerned with potentially losing and declining enrollment, which, like I said, we've been fortunate to basically maintain and slightly increase, whereas Dade and Broward are seeing declining enrollment. So we put in a marketing program last year that was funded through ESSER for Kindergarten Roundup. So you might have seen, informational material and online registration where there were commercials, billboards, flyers that were sent out to those that have school age students, and we saw that a tremendous benefit from that, and that's something that we feel is important to continue and is a priority of the board as well. And then professional development. So those all total about $5.3 million. So initially it was $8.6 million. Like I said, we are down to about $7.9 million right now, and I am still working to get the impact of the positions down even lower. And now I am going to ask Ms. Smith if she can walk through Title I, the title grants. She is the expert in all areas, so I asked her to please come and help me out.
Thank you. So Title I Part A funds are allocated to the district to ensure that students in schools with higher concentrations of poverty have access to a fair, equitable, and high-quality education. The state expands that definition and asks that we aim to assist those students in reaching, at a minimum, proficiency on challenging state standards and assessments, and the state ESSA plan lays out what those growth goals are for the state. So they want to close achievement gaps. They want to see increases in achievement and growth on all tested areas for students in K-12, and they want fewer low-performing DNF schools. So we budget our funds in support of those goals. The award for the district is based on a federal funding formula, and it takes into account poverty data. It doesn't necessarily use the same poverty measures we use within the district to allocate funds to schools. They use census data, which is a little different. This year's allocation, including roll forward, we budgeted based on $73.2 million. We expect 25 to be level funded. What we're going to see, what we saw this year in 24 was a little bit of a change in how the state allocated funds to the district. They actually initially withheld about 10% of our allocation for significantly expanding charter districts. There was a lot of pushback from districts around the state, and they amended their preliminary allocations to only withhold 6%. In the final allocation, they gave the district back about 3% of that 6%. So the net loss of our allocation was about 3% for significantly expanding charter schools. I anticipate, like I said, 25 to be about the same level funding. What I think we'll see in 26 is less roll forward. So as we lose ESSER dollars and schools are using their Title I allocations to the fullest, we'll see less money carried over in future years. The funds are available for use from July 1st to June 30th. We annually submit a grant to the state and ask for permission to use the funds in the way the schools want. So we aggregate all that information. And then the state takes time, and usually it's a lot of time, to review the application and get back to us and say yes or no. What we do as a district is we allow schools to move forward with their Title I plans without that award from the state. So we take a little bit of a risk, but it's to the benefit of the schools because we can't imagine telling them they can't spend any Title I dollars until after the award is received. When the FDOE reviews our application, there are things that they give special scrutiny to. So it impacts how schools allocate their funds. They put restrictions on consultants, professional development travel, field trips, and any use of incentive pay in the district. Next slide. So as Ms. Frederick, yes, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Are the restrictions on which consultants and what you give incentives for, or is it a dollar amount?
So for the consultants, it's a cap, $3,000 per consultant per day. So that limits the number of vendors that are able to work within that threshold. So they don't explicitly say you can't use this vendor, but there are vendors who can't work within that threshold, especially if they're nationally known and coming from out of state, because that includes travel in that cap. There are extenuating circumstances requests, and you can appeal to the state. We have not been very successful in getting extenuating circumstances approved. So Ms. Frederick referenced the thresholds, like we're hogtied by the state statute that requires us to keep the eligibility thresholds at the 16-17 school year levels. So we are serving a lot more schools as we've moved into the direct certification and CEP provision for the district. We are required by law to hold certain amounts of money aside. We have to serve Title I eligible students in private schools. The percentage of private school students eligible for these services has increased, so that means the amount of money that we set aside for that purpose has increased, and it takes it away from what we can allocate to our district-operated schools. We do serve charters in the same exact way that we serve district-operated schools, and that's required by law. We set aside money for McKinney-Vento purposes, so we served unhoused populations in our schools. We have delinquent and neglected programs that provide tutorial services for students in foster homes. There are pre-kindergarten activities that we spend money for, so we subsidize pre-K units at about 60%. Transportation for foster care children to their school of origin or choice programs. We are required to set aside money for that purpose. We set aside $350,000 annually. The cost is much more than that, and the district bears the cost in excess of what Title I can pay for. We are allowed to set aside funds not to exceed 1% for district initiatives in eligible schools. The district does not set aside funds for that purpose. It used to be where there wasn't a cap of that 1%. Instead of holding that money aside at the district level, we do allocate it out to the schools. Any funds that are rolled forward are not subject to those caps, but we use a significant amount of roll forward for our school allocations. We try annually to keep those school allocations as whole as possible, and it has increased the amount of money as we've increased the number of schools that we've had to allocate out to schools. Traditional schools and charter schools received $45.8 million for use in FY24. Again, we've moved to the direct certification times a 1.6 national multiplier instead of free and reduced price lunch in our school food service serviced schools. So any school participating in CEP, by law, you cannot collect free and reduced price lunch applications. We went over the thresholds earlier. The allocations to the schools are based on a per pupil allocation. So we multiply a dollar figure times the count of eligible students. And eligible students are those who are direct certified times that 1.6. Schools are required to develop a comprehensive school-wide plan that's based on a needs assessment. So they are right now going through a rigorous needs assessment process in order to develop a plan for FY25. Next slide. Before we go on to the next one, does anyone have questions about Title I, Part A?
I would just like to just mention quickly that these funds are in addition to the allocation they receive on the general fund side. So just because a school is receiving Title I dollars, we can't then adjust and reduce what we're allocating and why we use a standard staff formula on the general fund side. And then we also need to do something called, in order to confirm that we are treating title schools the same as non-title schools when we do our allocation, we're required to do what's called Title I comparability, and that's after the October survey count. And we have to look at every filled position in the general fund and make sure that title schools have the same average of filled positions in their schools. And if they don't, the first thing we do is look to see, do they have any teachers funded in Title I? Those teachers need to be moved into the general fund because the title money is supposed to be supplemental. It's because they have a higher need. And so we need to make sure that the schools are utilizing the funds with, how they're intended, and that they're not inadvertently, by not filling funds within positions within the general fund, they're inadvertently losing out on supplemental funds in order to provide additional initiatives and programs and supports to their students. So just wanted to mention that.
And I want to add, thank you, I want to add that when we do our allocations to schools, it's by a strict rank and serve process. The only consideration we can make in who we serve is the data that is pulled from Survey 3. So we are not allowed to consider other factors like what other supplemental sources of funding a school might have, what their performance levels are. It's strictly based on that direct certification times the multiplier. Okay.
So within the multicultural department, they're having a changeover in the director. So the director has now moved over, and she's the director of Safe Schools. Within the title the group of title programs, we have Title I Part C, which is specifically for migrant education. You know, it's about $2 million, and those supports are specifically for migrant students. And so, I mean, I can walk through each one, you know, otherwise, unless there's any specific questions. But it's a federal program specifically geared to migrant education, migrant students.
Title II, Part A, the purpose of Title II, Part A is to improve the quality and effectiveness of teachers, principals, and other school leaders, to increase the number of effective teachers, principals, and other school leaders, and to provide low-income and minority students greater access to effective teachers. The funds are used again from July 1st to June 30th. We have several initiatives that are at the district level in order to achieve those objectives. Title II funds are used for recruitment fairs, any fees that we pay if we travel to do recruiting, teacher ambassador programs. We supplement teacher certification testing. We pay for recruiting platforms. There are several staff in teaching and learning, actually 25 FTE. There are leadership development initiatives that work for the preparing future principals, the aspiring assistant principals programs. There are professional development and support teams in place through Title II. Title II funds also support the instructional support specialists and instructional superintendents that are in the regions, providing that intensive support to principals and schools and their administrative teams. And then there is a mental health professional development specialist who works with the mental health initiatives within the district.
All right, so then the next is Title III, and the Title III is just, you know, where the other was for migrant students. This is for all English language learner students. So we have supplemental supports for extended learning, tutorials, everything that we provide. All services within the title grants have got to be supplemental. They cannot supplant resources that we're providing in the regular operating fund. I also want to mention that with the title grants as well as IDEA, these are entitlement grants. They're not competitive, which means we're receiving this funding based on the number of eligible students. It's not a grant that we apply for per se. We do have to send in a budget application to the Florida Department of Education for them to approve all of the budget initiatives. And they are very strict. Florida Department of Ed is very strict when they review those applications. But the district is entitled to the funds. It's just the approval is more ensuring that DOE, it aligns with initiatives from the Florida Department of Ed. Doesn't necessarily mean if DOE denies it that it's not allowable under the federal requirements. The Florida Department of Ed can and is more restrictive than the federal government in terms of programs and initiatives, costs of different programs. And we have noticed that Florida Department of Education does not take into consideration where you live, to understand that it costs more in Palm Beach County than it may in other counties. So they hold all counties to the same level, which does get very difficult when we're at different professional development and different daily rates where DOE is very prescriptive in what they allow. Title III is for immigrants. And Title IV.
So Title IV Part A funds are for safe and healthy schools. They're for a well-rounded education and increase effective use of technology. There are minimum thresholds to meet with the allocation, so they ask you to set aside at least 20% of the funds for well-rounded initiatives, 20% for safe and healthy student initiatives, and then any of the remaining dollars can be allocated to the 3 buckets. There's a cap on technology devices and online programs. So when they talk about effective use of technology, they're looking more for how you are assisting teachers and students in using the technology that's provided through other funding sources, not necessarily buying that technology for their use. We have many well-rounded educational supports funded in Title IV, global education, dual language, world language instruction. We have reading recovery intervention. There are tutorial programs, IB and STEAM supports. We have behavior coaches for wraparound services and skills for learning in life. That's formally known as social emotional learning, but we're not allowed to say social emotional learning anymore. So the Skills for Learning in Life team has worked diligently to align their programming to the resiliency standards. And we've adjusted our application to reflect those new resiliency standards. There are district supports provided. There are single school culture coordinators in safe schools that help build supportive school climates. There are community resource persons that assist with the attendance initiatives. Professional development around the social studies world that include African American and Latino studies. And then there's the Train the Trainer Trailblazer initiative, where we work with individuals on school campuses to build their capacity to support their fellow teachers in using technology on their campus.
The 21st Century Community Learning Program is an after-school program, and it's not just just activities after school. It is a true after-school program to continue the academic learning after school. Palm Beach County has, I believe, has been awarded the most grants of any other county, I believe. And now Mr. McCormick is going to walk through IDEA.
Thank you. Well, specifically funds allocated to support students with disabilities, otherwise defined as students who are eligible under the 14 disability categories within IEP, is all based on state funding formulas around our general fiscal timeline between July and June. If any of the unused funds, if there are unused funds, we do have 1 year to be able to roll those funds forward to be able to expend those funds. Specifically with IDEA, IDEA funds like Title I, Part A are used to be supplemental. They're not designated to cover the full cost of providing special education services to students with disabilities. As the LEA, we are responsible for monitoring to ensure all funds are used to specifically pay the costs for the application Ms. Frederick was discussing within the specific grant application we submit and get approved by the state. All special education students receive general education teachers. Those general education, or you have like the math, science, social studies, English language arts, all of those teachers, whether they're the approximately 78% of our students who are in the general education setting for the majority of the day, those teachers are funded through the general fund. Even if those students receive the majority of their education in a special education setting, those teachers as well are funded by general education funds. Specifically about the IDEA allocation, these funds, and if there are positions funded out of IDEA, they're typically our behavioral interventionists or crisis intervention support, which is just a different name for behavioral intervention supports at a school site, mostly to support our students with autism and emotional behavioral disabilities. We also have resource teachers that have specific expertise to go into schools and provide direct support to be able to support schools. In addition, these personnel provide supplemental and specialized services, resources, and professional development in the list of supplemental services we see here. For example, audiology labs throughout the district, augmentative communication resources for students who don't speak, autism behavior resource teachers. We fully support inclusion for all students when it's appropriate or for the level of appropriateness for each individual student, parent services, curriculum, and then, of course, specialized services such as assistive technology and others. Next slide. So the professional development is extensive. All of these services that we're defining and I'm talking about out of the IDEA grant are also available to our charter schools. All of these trainings are also available to their charter schools. We work daily throughout the year to be able to provide these trainings as needed, but also as requested, and also on a scheduled basis to make sure that we're continuing to improve our services for students with disabilities.
So with that kind of menu, are they all virtual?
No, we actually have found that our teachers are really enjoying being in person and really engaging. We find, although virtual trainings are easy to provide because you can access people pretty much anywhere, it's easier to engage and monitor engagement in the face-to-face training opportunities. And believe it or not, we've seen a lot of participation in the in-person trainings that we've offered and received wonderful feedback as we kind of transition back into how we used to do business without forgetting the benefits of virtual training when appropriate.
And I want to thank Mr. McCormick because he truly has been a partner in implementing the staffing allocations that for the ESE, the special ed students, and implementation of IDEA. He's truly been a partner, teaching me, what it means and why there is such a differentiation in the support staff at the school sites based on the different program needs of the students. So he's been in this role now for...
As long as you.
Yeah.
Well, 10 years.
Because we did. I was, my first year as budget director was the same year that Mr. McCormick was director in IDEA. And I mean, we've worked very closely together to really refine and improve the allocations at the school sites to make sure that the resources are going to the schools and the students that truly have the need.
So with that collaboration, we've been truly able to focus on student achievement while being responsible in our fiscal management of staff and resources to make sure that we continue to focus on student achievement and also be financially responsible at the same time.
So I know today was a really long presentation, but it helps to give you an overview of the complete budget of the school district. And what it really comes down to, we have a very large budget of $5 billion. When you look at the general fund, we're not going to be making significant changes. Really where we're at, everything is staying status quo, except we're just waiting to hear what our funding is going to be from the state, which will help to determine the amount of funding that we have remaining for staff raises. When you look at what's open, we know that we have the ESSER, I say ESSER funding cliff, and we know that we have to use whatever new money we receive for the recurring increases we're pulling in from ESSER, which is now down to about 7.9 million, and I hope to get that down further. We have to look beyond to the continuation of the sales tax initiative, but when looking at the general fund, considering the uncertainty enrollment, we budgeted for and we added positions for enrollment increasing by 1,000, waiting till Count Day to see, are we going to actually realize that increase of the 1,000 students? The cost of the teachers and support staff to the increase in the additional staffing related to that increase in enrollment equates to about $3.3 million, which will have to come out of the new funding. The impact of FRS and what happens with which proposal is going to pass, whether it's the House or the Senate or something in between, that's going to have a significant impact on the funding that we have available. We are going to start working and meeting with the unions on the upcoming the health premiums for the upcoming year, effective January 1st of 2025. We know that we're going to have an increase. We have an increase in health claims. We had an increase in our health premiums January 1st. We are going to need another increase in our health premiums come January 1st of 2025. So that will have an impact on the budget. This continuation of the sales tax ties in with the escalation of capital costs. So we're seeing an increase in construction, maintenance, all costs related to capital, which directly impacts the amount that we have to set aside for that planned maintenance in order to properly maintain those buildings, which as up to the level of what we've been doing but we need the sales tax in order to supplement that, in order to reach and to continue to maintain the buildings at that level. And then just what other legislative changes are going to happen. I mean, we know this year there's nothing that's passed that's significant. It doesn't appear at this time there's anything that's significant. But last legislative session, we lost potentially $600 million over 10 years due to the change of sharing the capital millage with charter schools. So we lost money out of the state pool with the expansion of the voucher program. So what's going to happen in the future? So that's more of the beyond FY25. So that's what we're facing. The next time we meet, there is a budget workshop next Wednesday, March 6th. I will be able to provide more information at that meeting because there's going to be more information released this weekend on the actual detailed budget that was approved by the House and the Senate last night. So I'll be able to provide more information at that next board workshop. But in looking at what the impacts are with our budget, those are the changes that we're looking at. So it's bringing in the ESSER funds, everything else staying the same other than bringing in the ESSER funds, adding in funding for the additional staffing for schools based on the increase in enrollment, looking at finishing our department reviews. Although we're not going to be adding positions, we are going to have increases in just standard contractual increases that were already embedded within the agreements. So I do expect to have some just general increases, but we're going to try to minimize any of the changes related to positions, limiting that to just capital and those positions that would be capital funded. So those are really the changes we're looking at. And then just that uncertainty with what's going to happen with FRS and also with our health premiums. So we didn't have our budget advisory committee, our first one in February, and we also did not have our second budget workshop with the board February 7th because we really didn't have any new information to report at that time. So our next board workshop is next Wednesday on the 6th, like I mentioned. Our next budget advisory committee meeting is on March 29th, and that's when all of our department reviews will have been completed. So I'll be able to give you the exact picture of where we stand within the budget of what those actual numbers are. Our tentative budget adoption is on July 31st, and our final budget adoption is on September 4th. And so with that, are there any other additional questions? No. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next item, which is election of the chair and vice chair. Since this is the first meeting of the year for the Budget Advisory Committee, I we are required to elect a chair and vice chair. I did want to mention that with the current advisory policy, the chair is limited to 4 consecutive years. Ms. Brown has served in the capacity of the chair for 5 years. The committee has the ability, and within the policy, there is the ability to request a waiver from the board in order to allow the chair to continue to serve, and it is something that we have to ask each year. So I first wanted to ask the committee, before we go forward with a election of the chair or nominating for the chair, whether the committee would want to entertain asking the board for a waiver to have Ms. Brown continue, if that is something that Ms. Brown would want to do.
If she would do it, I recommend that we ask for the extension.
I agree.
I don't mind serving, but if there's somebody who would like to serve, you can speak up and say you would like to, but I don't mind doing it either.
Okay, so if we could take a vote of all the members of those who support going forward and asking the board for a waiver to extend the term for an additional year. Yes? Whether you support, because I need to officially get support, a vote from everybody. Mr. Parks, I guess if I don't hear anything to the negative, I'll assume that it's affirmative. All right, so we will do that. Now, the next item is, we will start with the selection of the chair, and I will now take nominations from the committee members for the chair. Are there any nominations? Okay, and do I hear a second? All right, all in favor? If I could hear everyone say aye. Or if there's anyone who does not agree to speak up now. All right, well, congratulations, Ms. Brown, for being nominated chair. We will now take nominations for the vice chair. Our current vice chair is Ms. Lori Benino, and there is no limitation on the number of years for being vice chair. So do we have any nominations for vice chair?
I would say if Lori's willing to serve again, and I would nominate Lori.
And Ms. Benino, she said yes? She did. Okay. All right, so are there any other nominations? You second? Okay. All right. So everyone in favor of electing Ms. Benino as vice chair, please say aye. All right. All right,
Aye.
well, thank you. So congratulations, Ms. Benino, for being elected vice chair. All right.
And thanks to both of you for taking that responsibility.
Faith, you did it for a really long time too, so I'm always glad when you're here.
All right, so our next meeting is, like I mentioned, Friday, March 29th at 9 a.m. I don't expect it to be as long, because we will have the final budget numbers, and it will just be going over, just finalizing the changes that I mentioned today that I know will be reflected in the upcoming budget. All right,
That's it, we're adjourned.
all right, and
We're adjourned.
thank you all.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks.